Imagine the entire human story squeezed into one small village, 1,280 souls holding their breath while the world turns colder for 117,000 years. Tonight, we drift back 900,000 years to the moment we almost vanished, and the quiet, stubborn miracles that kept our flame alive. Settle in, breathe slowly, and let the past grow soft at the edges. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Picture an afternoon that never quite warms, a sky the colour of stone, wind carrying a dry taste that once meant the end of a season, and now means the shape of a whole lifetime. Grass has thinned to bristles, roots exposed like old ropes. The river that used to talk all day has learned to whisper. On its bank, a small band of people move the way careful animals move, slow, reading the ground, saving steps like coins they cannot afford to spend. In a world that has been quietly subtracting itself for generations, every decision is a hinge: where to sleep, where to dig, where to leave a sign that says we passed this way and found enough to see tomorrow. They wake before light because cool air is cheap and heat is expensive. The fire has been kept alive all night, banked under ash, a dull heart that needs only breath and patience to resume its glow. No one wastes sparks. Fire is a second sun you can carry in crack gourd lined with clay, tucked in woolly bark, guarded by the one who walks in the middle so wind won't steal it. Water comes first. It always comes first. They know the slope of the land by memory, where the bedrock folds and cups the little springs, where green holds later than brown, where a singer bird will perch only when insects are still hatching, and insects hatch only when moisture lingers under the crust. A child is taught to listen with their feet. Cool, sand means seeping water below. Hot sand means move on. Food is a long conversation with the ground. The day offers termites that taste of nut and dust, beetle grubs found where a dead tree softens in the hand, a clutch of eggs kept from the sun by a slant of rock, a root that yields only after fire has told it how to be tender. Meat is not the centre. Meat is a festival the world throws in a quiet season, rare enough that stories of the last one are told even as smoke from this one rises. Mostly there is gathering and grinding, scraping and soaking, testing the bitterness of leaves against the memory of a tongue that remembers last dry season and the one before. A woman chews a strip of bark and watches a child's eyes. If the brow tightens, that bark is teaching, not feeding, and it goes to the basket marked for medicine in the way only hands can mark. The tools are plain and precise. A good stone is chosen for the way it breaks, for the song it makes when two pieces speak to each other, for the shape you can see under the skin of it. Edges are planned, not guessed. A flake is struck for scraping hides, another for cutting sinew, another for coaxing fibres from a plant that looks like nothing until you twist it and it becomes cord. Waste is a luxury they do not have, so the plan is taught before the blow is ever struck. A boy holds a core and an elder rests a finger where the next scar should appear, and when it does, the boy learns what a map feels like when the map is in stone. If you stood far away and watched them cross the plain, you would think they were scattered, but they are not. Each person has a place the others can find without looking. The tall walker is a windbreak. The one with the quick eyes hunts ahead and circles back to place a marker of thorns where the ground dips. The strongest does not lead. The strongest carries. Babies ride high against warm backs, lulled by the rhythm of steps that have measured this land for a century of lives. Elders walk where the path is smoothest, and the group shortens its stride to match their breath as naturally as a flock turns in air. They do not speak much in the heat. Words are a nighttime thing, shaped near the fire when shadows make space for memory. The earth keeps a ledger. Footprints pressed in damp sand become a story that someone else can read before the wind erases it. There are signs that never get spoken aloud because everyone knows them. 3 lines scratched near a stand of reeds means water is sweet here but shallow. A circle of stones with a gap to the east means there was meat, and there may be bones if the jackals have not carried all of it away. A twist of grass tied low means watch your ankles, the burrows in this patch are bad. In a thin world, warnings are kindness, and kindness is wealth. A stranger's footprint is interesting but not frightening. If they are close enough to leave sign, they are close enough to be kin in some distant way, and if they have left you a handful of seeds as greeting, you leave them a little fire as return. The wind used to be a season, now it is a constant. It sifts thoughts, dries meat, steals moisture from skin and mud from wells, scours paint from rock faces so that handprints fade faster than they used to. People adjust the way all animals adjust. They make more shade from less material, fold shelters tighter, throw them higher into acacia branches where the air is cooler by a finger's width. They learn to sleep in thin slices, a few breaths at a time, trading watch without waking the young, keeping the fire fed with bits of twig and thorn so the night sounds stay at the proper distance. Hyenas laugh, rude and bright, and everyone smiles because laughter means hyenas, and hyenas mean something. Bigger has eaten not far from here. News in a hungry time is a kind of food, and they pass it around, speculating with hands that mimic horns and hooves, a language of shapes and pauses that children grasp before they know how to count. Once the rains came on a schedule you could sing. Now they arrive like a guest who does not always knock. Clouds gather and dissolve on the same afternoon. A dark line on the horizon excites no one until the first drops tick the skin, and even then, a third of the band moves toward higher ground. Insurance against the flash flood that sometimes sweeps away a careless camp and leaves its cooking stones tumbled in a dry fan. The smiles are small and private when the real rain arrives, but shoulders relax and faces tip to the sky, and tongues catch what they can because water on the tongue is a promise your body believes. Children stomp in the first mud like artists, their feet inventing new shapes, their shouts soft and decorated with the lightest kind of joy, the kind that does not challenge hunger, but takes its hand and walks beside it for a little while. The animals are thinner too, and warier. A herd of antelope used to graze like a low fire on the hillside. Now it moves like a rumour, here and gone, a line of moving commas that needs a paragraph of patience to make sense. The people watch them and learn. They imitate the patience of predators, the caution of mothers with calves, the sudden freezes that save a life when wind shifts and danger changes direction. When they do hunt, it is with geometry more than muscle. Angles that close, shadows that lie where hooves will least expect them. A rush only when the answer has been built from many small correct guesses. If they fail, and failure is common, they fail as a group together, so that no one is hurt alone and the story can be told as instruction rather than blame. In the heat of noon they rest not because they are lazy, but because they are accountants, keeping a ledger of calories in and out, tracking the smallest vigour as if it were gold dust. Work is stacked on the edges of the day. Fibres soaked at dusk are twisted at dawn. Hide scraped when the air is cool will not sour as quickly. Stones are chosen with the sun low so their colours are honest. A woman threads sinew through a hole she made with a bone awl and hums a tone meant to keep her hands from rushing and tearing, because every misstep echoes, and echoes are expensive. Children are given tasks no heavier than learning. Fetch this plant by its smell, not its shape. Follow the shadow of that bird until you can tell me where it sleeps. Count the breaths between the lightning and the thunder, and tell me if tonight we shelter low or high. Illness comes like weather. It is prepared for in the same spirit. There is a root that eases cough, a leaf that cools a wound, a clay that quiets the stomach if you do not ask too much of it. They do not name these things with finality. They say, "This helped your aunt last season, we will see if it helps you," and they watch. A fever breaks in the morning and a grandmother nods as if a bargain has been honoured. Another time the fever holds, and they sit close and fan gently, and speak of old hunts and old rains, and keep the flies away with a patience that is larger than hope, but smaller than grief. When someone dies, and people do die, because the world is what it is, they are carried to soft ground and spoken about as if they had just gone ahead to scout a new path. And perhaps they have. At night, when the fire takes its comfort back from the dark, words come. They are not big words. They are not theories. They are bearings. The line of hills that looks like a sleeping animal will shade the right-hand spring after the sun moves past the high rock. The thorn with 3 claws grows where the earth is sweeter. Find it, and tubers are near. The bird that calls twice and then is silent tells you a cat walks. The wind from the west smells of stone, not water. Do not be fooled by the cloud it brings. A story about a great hunt might hold a map folded into its centre. A story about a foolish man might be a warning about wasting fire. A lullaby is a memory palace disguised as care, placing plants and paths in a rhythm a child's body will keep when fear erases detail. They do not argue about the ski, but they watch it. Stars are nails that hold the night in place, and some of those nails shift their holes over the long years, and the elders know this and say so without insisting on why. The moon is a friend who comes fat with gifts and leaves thin on bare feet. Its calendar is not the only one they keep, but it is the one a child can read without tools. When the bright path of the Milky Way leans a certain way, insects are aplenty. When it leans the other, you spend more time at the river because fish are foolish then, dazzled by the moon and easy to catch. The sky is not a story of gods, it is a ledger of light, and light is the only thing that never lies. There is trade, though no one calls it that. A long journey brings a stranger with a pouch of hard dark stone not found here, and an old man turns it in his hand, smiling subtly, because he can already see a dozen edges in it. For this gift they offer dried meat, a bead carved from bone that carries the warmth of many palms, a lesson in the way this valley makes wind late in the day. The exchange is not counted in items, but in futures. Stone becomes tools, tools become food, food becomes time, time becomes children who can learn, and learning is the richest thing anyone owns. When the stranger leaves, 2 of the young walk with them as far as the ridge, safety and also curiosity, and they stand there long after the figures have shrunk to a seam in the distance, memorizing the horizon because tomorrow or next moon they may need to read it alone. Sometimes the world offers a small kindness without reason. A carcass carried by floodwater snags in reeds not 50 paces from camp. A fig tree throws a late crop because some deep root found a crack of moisture. A swarm of bees settles low and docile in cool air, and smoke persuades them to share what they have gathered. Honey touches tongues that have not tasted sweetness in seasons, and people laugh with their eyes closed, and for a moment the band looks like a festival you would have recognized in any century. They do not squander it. A gourd is sealed. A little is saved for the elder whose cough has dived with them all year. Children are asked to describe the flavour, so their mouths will remember it when their bellies cannot. If you listen to their sleep, it is not silence. Dreams are busy because the day is busy. The mind sorts paths, edits mistakes, files the shape of a creek bank under a word the child will wake up able to say. A woman who walked the same ground twice in one morning and found 2 different answers will dream it a 3rd time and wake with a way to not be fooled. The band's safety is not just in bodies near bodies, but in minds near minds, sharing load like a net shares weight. When a baby whimpers, 3 people stir. When someone coughs, a gourd is tilted without the cougher asking. They are not saints, they have jealousies and weariness like anyone forced by the world to keep moving. But they have a talent for deliberate kindness, and in this era, that is not decoration, It is infrastructure. There is a number behind all of this that no one living then could count, and yet their bones and breath know it. There are not many of us. You feel it in the way strangers look familiar. In the rare times two bands meet and stand a careful distance and then step closer, mirroring, palms open to show nothing held, smiles that are not show but blueprint. Sometimes the meeting yields a mate, sometimes a story, sometimes the shared maintenance of a spring that will serve both fires if both fires tend it well. The math of survival prefers addition to subtraction, and they have learned to do sums with lives. The climate keeps its own counsel. Seasons lengthen into moods that last longer than childhoods. The long cycles grind forward, ice and ocean making agreements far away that Africa must honour whether it wishes to or not. Yet within that grinding, small reversals happen, and small reversals are the handles a clever species can grab. A few greener years string together. A line of hills that used to shed their water too quickly begins to hold it in pockets no one has mapped yet. Birds change their routes by a day or two, and on that day or two, the band changes its route as well, as lightly as a hand correcting a stitch. Somewhere ahead, not far and not near, a place is beginning to be the kind of place that can be stayed in, and the people who have survived by moving learn the shape of it with the same patience they have learned everything else. They do not know it yet, but the ground is starting to keep promises again, and they are already practicing how to listen when promises are made. No one living there would have called it a refuge. It was simply the place where enough still gathered, light in the mornings that didn't punish, a wind that arrived tired and left politely, ground that held its own shadow long enough for small things to grow under it. Hills leaned together to make a pocket where clouds snagged and squeezed out a patient rain. A vein of stone ran like a hidden spine beneath the soil, channeling water into seeps that never fully forgot their duty. When the wider world thinned to rumour, this basin remembered to feed a reed bed, to pool a palm's roots, to lay a glassy skin the children could break with a stick and taste the cold underneath. It was not generous, only steady. In a long emergency, steady as a miracle that keeps its voice low. Shelter began as a habit of noticing. A notch in a cliff that held morning light but refused the afternoon blaze. A thicket of thorn that kept hyenas respectful but allowed people to pass if they knew the trick of turning sideways and walking like smoke. Ribs of dead wood arched into domes thatched with grasses combed from the riverside, the kind that dry to a pale whisper and shed rain like the backs of birds. Inside, the ground was polished by knees and palms, patterned by basket bottoms, cool where someone lifted a mat to air it in the morning and set it down again at dusk. Smoke wandered up through a small hole trimmed neat with clay. When it rained, a plug of leaves slid into place as easily as a thought completed. Firecraft was the second heartbeat of the place. Coals carried in a cradle of punky wood and dry fungus, always a spare ember, tucked where wind could not reach. The old ones taught friction not as spectacle but as patience, a board of softer wood, a spindle of harder wood, thumbs that pressed without hurrying, a bow drill that sang in a tone you could feel in your teeth. Resin sealed the seams of gourd-lidded ember pots. Ash sealed the memories of meals, tamped carefully around the edges of the hearth so that rain could not bully it. They learned to read fire the way they read tracks. A yellow flame meant wet wood sulking. A blue thread meant clean heat for stone boiling. A low red meant it was time to slide a clay ball from the coals and tuck it into a pit with roots to wake their sweetness. At night, the fire was braided into social life. Embers raked thin for the quiet work. Embers huddled thick for talk. A separate spool tongue of flame for those who had died that season, so the living heat would not be asked to carry everything alone. Water was tended like a garden that moved very slowly. They learned the geography of seep and spring as intimately as names. Reed mats laid across a muddy lip caught silt and left clearer trickles downstream. A line of flat stones set where 100 feet had churned a bank into paste, turned it into steps. Baskets lined with clay and fired low became cool jars half buried in shade, their necks wrapped in wet fibre that made them sweat and chill. When the wind grew rough for a week at a time and the seeps grew shy, the people walked to an old gorge where past floods had torn the earth open. There, beneath a bed of pebbles, the sand tasted damp through the fingertip, and digging made a wide-mouthed well that they covered with thorn and a weave of branches so that animals could drink without falling in. Children were given the task of listening to jars. A good jar spoke in a fat glug. A jar going dry had a thin panic in it, and that sound meant the next morning's work began before dawn. Food making was choreography. Fish traps were fences with opinions, low lattices of sticks and woven vines set where the current narrowed, patient combs that guided the forgetful into baskets baited with crushed snails. Smoking racks rose like small scaffolds in the breeze, and smoke that had dried leaves in it lent a sweetness that let meat last into a second moon. Stone boiling turned piles of river cobbles into utensils. Pit lined with hide and filled with water could be brought to a confident simmer by moving heated stones back and forth with forked sticks. The sound the water made when it accepted a stone was different than the sound it made when it wanted to spit it out. And children learned that music the way they learned the songs for pounding tubers to paste. There were calendars in the foods as much as there were foods in the calendar. The termite flights after the first real rain, the tubers that peeled clean only when the grass seed stalks had turned a certain colour, the figs that were always 2 days later on the south-facing tree than on the one tucked under the rock wall. Tool settled into a grammar. There were edges for scraping green hides until they blushed pale and soft, edges for splitting reeds without shredding them, edges for nicking a finger if you forgot to hold a piece of sinew at exactly the length where it would yield to the stone's impatience. Glue had recipes. Plant sap warmed until it thickened, a pinch of charcoal to grant it spine, a smear of beeswax to keep it from shattering when the evening turned suddenly cool. Hafting was not a single act but a week of small devotions, wrap, cure, test, re-wrap. By the time a point met its handle, the hand that made it knew what the tool would prefer to do, and the hunt was planned to honour that preference. Basketry grew from the ground up. Flood grasses stripped and twisted into cords, cords crossed into nets, nets turned to bags with stones tied into their bottoms to keep their mouths open in water where shrimp moved like commas. The refuge made room for crafts that seemed like luxuries until you understood they were storage for luck. Beads cut from river shell and polished against thigh and leather became not only beauty but record, colours and counts that could mark who owed whom a bundle of smoked fish, or how many days had passed since scouts from the north had brought news of a new seep opening beyond the black fig grove. Ochre found in a crumble of cliff was ground fine and mixed with fat, daubed on forearms as sun armour and on rock as memory, a spiral to mark the tricky crosswind that could carry smell to a lion's patience, a line of dots to mark how many throws it had taken to bring down an antelope at the bend where the river thought about turning but didn't. On a shaded face, handprints gathered in a loose swarm, small and large, some missing a finger because a finger had been lost, some because a finger had been safely folded back when pigment was blown, for reasons that had explanations once, but now lived only in the smiles of those who could still remember them when asked. Social life learned the art of quiet abundance. Daily choices were made by the ones who knew that morning best. Sometimes an elder with the maps memorized into bones, sometimes the young woman who had found a new way to fold thorn so it combed hyena paths the wrong way. Big choices took longer and were laid out at night on the floor, figurines of knotted reed marking people, lines of ash marking rivers, a handful of pebbles borrowed from the sleeping jar to mark food that could travel. Disputes were unbraided rather than cut. The words for mine and ours sat close to each other in the mouth, and in a place where survival ran on the narrow path of enough, words were walked carefully. A quarrel about a fishing spot might become a story about grandfather's mistake, which became a lesson about current that saved everyone a day later. The one who mediated best was not necessarily the loudest or the oldest. It was the person others relaxed around, the one who knew how to say yes and to two truths that didn't fit in one basket. Children were taught with errands that were disguised as games. Bring me the plant that smells like rain when it is bruised. Show me 3 stones that could become knives and tell me which is a liar. Find the shadow at noon that matches your height and use it to measure how far a cry carries over water. When they failed, the correction came with the story of someone's own failure, so that shame did not sand the edges of curiosity. Play adjusted equipment for future tasks. Reed boats nudged along quiet pools, trained hands for weaving and eyes for water's grammar. Target games with berries that burst on impact taught distance and arc without asking small arms to lift heavy spears. Night stored the lessons deeper. Songs that placed plants in order around the camp as if the world were a bracelet. Rhythms that matched the pace of safe walking so that small bodies learned how not to tire before the day did. Illness and injury were met with rituals that were also protocols. A blood-stopping powder ground from a certain bark, the bark harvested only at dawn when the tree was not yet defensive. Smoke blown over a wound from a bundle of dry leaves whose names made a poem that made breath slow to the pace where pain is thinkable. Fever had a diet and a music. Those who had walked through fevers and back again carried amulets of stitched skin, with pebbles that sounded like rain when shaken. The sound, not the talisman, calmed the nervous system of a child who did not know the word for nervous system, but recognized in their bones the way breath could be coaxed into drawing a longer line. Death had its own careful craft, a washing, a wrapping, a path taken to a hill where the wind always had news. The living returned by a route that crossed running water so the grief would not learn to follow them home every night. Animals were neighbours with whom terms could be negotiated. Bees were offered smoke and stones. The stones warmed at the hive entrance on cold mornings, so the colony would wake softly and not with panic. Vultures were watched with gratitude and suspicion. Their spirals wrote messages no one else could write. Dogs, when they came gradually, a family of wild ones learning that the circle of light did not always mean danger, a pup that learned not to snap at the hand that fed it scraps, and then learned the smell of the people's children, and then learned to announce a stranger before the stranger had decided whether to be generous or to be trouble. The lines between wild and companion were smudged like charcoal, but a smudge can be legible to those who made it, and the smudge saved lives. The refuge was not a single point, but a breathing arrangement of points. Camps rotated like constellations across a few days' walk, each with a use no other place could quite replace. The stone ear, the cliff that gathered sound from far away and bent it down the trail so you could hear hooves long before you could see dust. The bitter mouth, the spring that tasted wrong unless you boiled its water with a handful of leaves from the crooked tree that leaned toward the old lightning scar. The quiet shelf, a ledge of rock that seemed unremarkable until the one day each year when the sun slid along it like a blade and lit a cave's mouth that otherwise stayed secret and cool enough to keep fish firm for days, even when heat pressed its face close to everything else. Names were not decorations. They were the passwords a landscape set for those who cared to belong. Trade webs spread from this centre like threads a spider can feel through its feet, reading the world by tremor. People from the north brought stone that split like ice, a miracle under a hammerstone. Clean, fast edges, dangerous to careless thumbs, stingy only when struck at the wrong angle. From the south came seed that behaved like trapped rain, grains that when shaken loose grew again in places that had been stubborn. The refuge paid for these with things it had in surplus, only because surplus had been redesigned to mean anything that arrived exactly when someone else needed it. Knowledge of a trail that stayed dry after violent weather, a way to warm resin so it cured hard but not brittle, a song that taught children to count the breaths between lightning and thunder, with a game that made them laugh. Webs like these did not make anyone rich by the future's definitions, they made everyone less brittle. The mind's tools grew alongside the hands. Memory palaces were built from the refuge outward. You placed a plant at the bend in the gorge, a recipe at the foot of the scorched fig, an uncle's warning at the notch in the ridge where the wind always arrived dishonest. A walker could travel 3 days alone and speak the whole way to the world, touching markers with voice and foot, rehearsing what each one held, so that arrival anywhere in the basin felt like a conversation resumed rather than a search begun. When strangers arrived with their own palaces in their heads, there was a beautiful awkwardness of translation. Your sleeping lizard hill might be their bent knee hill. Your cat wind might be their salt breath, and the process of aligning images was as much a barter as the swapping of tools. Weather was a teacher with moods. Drought wrote its lessons in blunt strokes. Ration the walking, ration the clocking, lay the work where shade can do some of it for you. But there were softer chapters. Fog that arrived off the river and held to the ground until mid-morning, left beads on leaves big enough to sip. The practice of leaf drinking was assigned to small hands that felt important, and importance is a fuel that burns clean. Cold years asked for new forms of kindness, sleeping in tighter braids, learning to share breath with infants the way soft animals do, refining windbreaks until they sang less and sighed more. Heat taught geometry, huts turned so the smallest face met the sun at its worst, paths lined with pale stones so walking did not throw back as much anger. The people became engineers by repetition, not by title. In all of this, there was room for decoration because decoration was another way to measure and to remember. A line carved along a spear thrower's length that fit the user's hand became an ergonomic adjustment. Add repeating chevrons and it became a ruler you didn't have to call a ruler. Hair braided with the seeds of a plant that repelled biting flies announced both the season and a preparation. If you saw that braid at a distance, you knew which camp recipe had been refreshed. Laughter was not a waste. It moved breath, and breath moved blood, and blood moved courage, and courage allowed a band to make decisions before fear congealed them into the wrong shape. The refuge taught a modest metaphysics, that tending is louder than taking, that maps are made from verbs before they are drawn in lines, that enough can be designed and maintained even when abundance cannot be summoned. People learned to greet the day not as entitlement, but as a cascade of coordinated chores that made living possible without exhausting the future. Feet learned the softest path between 2 points. Minds learned the softest path through 2 opinions. Hands learned the softest path through 2 materials that would crack if bullied into cooperation. When a new seep opened where the hill slumped after a wet season, no one cheered. They nodded and moved a ring of stones, and then they argued gently about which camp the change favoured for its next turn in the rotation, and then they slept a little better for a while, and then they woke and watched again, because watching was the work that made all other work possible. If you visited, and stayed long enough to forget you were visiting, you would notice how often people looked at the ground. It was not subservience to the earth, it was respect for the conversation underfoot. Ant lines crossing a path meant a sweetness had fallen nearby. The way dust sat on a blade of grass told you which way the breeze had been running at dawn. A cluster of tiny holes in a pattern, like the night's dry constellation, told you the sand had been drilled by worms that come up only when a certain humidity sits 4 finger widths below the surface, which meant the well would be kinder than it looked. Even the footprints of their own children were read like messages, not to monitor but to understand. A new hesitancy in the left foot might mean a thorn had been pulled but not forgotten. A pause before a jump might mean the child's eyes were learning distances more honestly. Nothing about the refuge was permanent. That was its skill. It could be folded and carried, a way of setting stones, a way of listening for frogs that sang under the ground before rain, a way of placing a nap so that hunger could be met with precision. When something failed, an old seep going brackish, a stand of reeds dying back after decades of quiet service, the people did not treat it as betrayal. They performed a leaving that was as deliberate as arrival had been. They filled the shallow pits where they had kept jars so that small ankles would not twist in them. They smoothed the ash where cooking had left a rich dark on the earth so that the smell would not mislead animals into risky curiosity. They braided a marker into the nearest thorn so that those who came later would know this was a place that had fed well once, and might again if weather and chance and a handful of good decisions conspired. At dusk, the refuge sounded like breath. Work settled into murmurs. The river ticked against stones, relieved of the day's hands. Smoke combed the air into stripes that faded where stars began to insist. Conversations untied themselves from the day's knots and became lines of quiet invention, a way to string gourds so that a shoulder could carry more without bruising, a test to decide whether the wind would lie at midnight, a game of listening for distant hooves and naming the animal without standing to see it. Somewhere beyond the hills, empty country exhaled dust and regret. Inside the basin, water exhaled something kinder, and the people folded the day's edges under, not to close it, but to keep it from fraying before morning arrived to ask again whether they could make enough from what the world would give them today. There is a seam in us that most of us will never see. It sits quiet in every cell, 2 old pieces joined into one, a soft weld made in deep time and passed along like a family recipe no one remembers learning. If you could walk the spiral stair of your DNA with a lantern, you would come to that seam and notice how the thread changes weave for a moment. Old telomere fringes turned inward, a spare centromere asleep like a relic, and then the familiar pattern resumes, as if the cloth had always been whole. We live with that seam the way we live with the shape of our hands, ordinary and astonishing at once. It is not a banner we carry, it is a quiet note that plays under everything else, a proof that small events can become the only events when a people is reduced to a handful and time is patient. That is how it often worked in the long thin years. With so few of us, chance itself had a louder voice. A harmless quirk, an extra fold in a protein, a slightly different way a brain laced 2 neighbourhoods together, could drift through the little world of our bodies until it was not a quirk anymore but simply how things were. Drift is not design, and yet in a life measured against storms and sharp edges, drifts carried not just oddities but solutions across generations. In the refuge and its satellites, babies were born into a genetic library that shrank and clarified at the same time, shelves of missing books but also a handful of volumes that everybody read. When a trait helped even a little, it had fewer rungs to climb to become the norm. When a trait harmed, it had fewer places to hide. The math was not kind, but it was efficient. You can feel the result today in the way we resemble each other, more than we think we do. Across oceans and languages, the range of our faces sits inside a small circle compared with the scatter of our cousins in the trees. That tightness is a scar and a bond. It cost us resilience against some sicknesses. It gave us a shared starting point that made strangers legible long before words could carry the burden. In the tightness, cooperation became not just a good idea but an element like air, present, invisible, fatal in its absence. In bands where every meal needed a dozen gestures to succeed, the eyes learn to anticipate and the hands learn to accept. You pass the stone now, I pass the water later. No one keeps a tally because the body keeps one in its muscles and breath and relaxes when the exchange feels right. At night, by the tame red of coals, the mind learned new routes. The day taught the hands to make and the feet to travel. The dark taught the tongue to braid. A tool shape spoken into a story could cross a valley faster than a runner. A warning wrapped in a joke made its way into a child's head without catching on the barbs of fear. Names thickened around things that mattered. The edible root had 3 names. One for the leaf, one for the sort of soil that smelled right when you were close, one for the music it made when tapped. Grammar did not arrive like a drumbeat. It accreted like soot, a thin layer of structure that made it easier for thoughts to take hold. We learned to nest clauses the way we nested baskets, to hold 2 ideas at the same time, without dropping either. A thought like, if this wind holds, then the spring will cloud, became a thought like, if this wind holds and the child is still coughing, then we go by the long path because the dust on the short will settle in her breath. And that was enough to keep one family intact through a week that might have broken it otherwise. Inside skulls that were using fire's extra calories to build more rooms, certain corridors were swept more often. Pattern hunger grew strong. The mind learned to find the rhyme between the swirl of a vulture and the rumour of hooves beyond sight, between the colour of grass at ankle height and the depth of a hidden soak in the sand, between the jag on a stone flake and the job it would do without complaint. Attention became a muscle that did not tire easily. We learned to watch our own watching, to ask what the eyes might have missed on the path they took. Nothing mystical, just a species discovering that the future was hidden in the present like a folded map, available to anyone who could unfold it slowly and keep from tearing the creases. Teaching turned into architecture. The refuge had no walls, but knowledge made rooms. The youngest slept in one that smelled of resin and cordage, so that binding and untying entered their fingers along with comfort. Adolescents claimed the high ledge where wind dehydrates meat, learning the physics of air with their skin and the economics of patience with their stomachs. Elders lived everywhere at once without moving, because their words placed a scaffold over the whole basin, strong enough that when someone fell through a misstep of judgment, the net caught them before the ground did. You can think of this as culture, but the word is too crisp for a thing so woven. It was closer to climate, a weather of affection and correction that made certain kinds of learning almost inevitable. Stone remembered for us, far from the river, on plates of shade the same blade shapes began to appear, as if carved by one hand. They were not copies, they were convergences, a sign that the problem of making a durable edge had been asked enough times that the answers started to rhyme. When a hunter from a neighbouring band picked up a point and smiled because it fit his grip without introduction, that was an agreement not negotiated by speech, but by physics and the social drift of usefulness. Standardization sounds cold, a word with corners. In these camps it was a form of generosity. Make it so that anyone can use it, and you have given someone a future version of you a little more time to think about something else. The body reorganized around these commitments. Breath slowed at night, not just from rest, but because lullabies taught it. Heart rates learned to follow stories, rising in the hunt scene, lowering during the scenes of repair and making. Babies whose nervous systems could be soothed by rhythm had an easier time learning fine motions. Fine motions led to fewer wasted flakes, fewer ruined skins, fewer snapped handles at terrible moments. 1,000 tiny gains stacked into a steadier season. Those who could teach the body to quiet itself passed that skill to their children's bodies without language. And language then named what had already been learned. Calm hands, deep breath, long eyes, soft feet. Qualities turned into identities we recognized and rewarded. Even the ways we argued adapted. In a thinning world, stubbornness could be fatal unless it was balanced by a new competence, the ability to hold a model of someone else's mind and run simulations inside it. If I tell her that the short path is safe, will she think I am saving my own strength at her expense? If he is silent after the hunt, is he angry at the miss? Or is he listening for a predator I have not noticed? The brain that could manage these questions prevented fights the way a well-built dam prevents floods, not by confronting force with force, but by redirecting it before it gathers. Over lifetimes, that skill, what we now dress in the big clothes of empathy and theory of mind, was selected for the simplest reasons. Groups that had more of it buried, fewer of their own. The seam in our chromosome is a relic of that time, and so are 1,000 little habits that never made it into song. Taste for bitterness in small amounts that kept us from eating poison, but also told us when a root carried the medicine we needed. A bias toward faces that look back at us with a certain steadiness. Not a beauty standard, but an assessment of reliability in a world where reliability kept fire alive during rain. A reflex for joint attention. Two gazes locking onto a third thing, look there. Our dilated pupils telling each other the size of the danger or the size of the opportunity. The laboratory words for all this would come later. In the bottleneck, their names were the shapes of throats clearing and the length of a pointed finger. Our art, such as it was, carried data in its belly. A spiral might be pretty on a rock wall, but it also said wind around this hill behaves like this. A series of dots could be a game played by children. It could also be an enumeration of throws between misses that told you when a kind of prey was becoming too wary and needed to be left alone for a month if you wanted it to exist next season. Beauty functioned as compression, information that wished to travel far commoned itself to pleasure so that it would be repeated without being asked. A song with an easy chorus did the same. Sing it twice and a child could carry 1,000 steps worth of directions in their mouth without ever having seen a drawn map. When numbers needed holding, we held them in bodies. 10 is fingers, 20 is hands and feet, 60 is 3 good hunts with 2 throws each that landed true. A tally scored in accord with knots you could feel even in the dark when counting silently beside a sleeping baby. Names for quantities came through metaphor. A skinful, a hill's worth, a morning's walk of grubs. Precision hid in the gesture, the way the hand swelled open to indicate plenty or kept 2 fingers pressed close to mean barely. In time, the counting turned into a more specific tool for fairness. How much did one band owe another after a dry year when the river failed on one side of the basin and the other side shared from what it had put away? Enough that the balance felt right in the chest, and later, when balance needed defending, the old cord with its knots could be brought out and read by everyone present, fingers telling what tongues might be tempted to distort. Mating too learned geometry. With so few, the danger of pairing too close to one's own circle was immediate. Rules emerged, not as commandments, but as paths worn into custom. A mate should come from the camp over the ridge where the wind smells different. Marriages should unroll over seasons with gifts and visits so that a person became legible to a new group before they belonged to it. Children should carry stories of both sides in their pockets so that, if food grew strange in one place, they could arrive in the other with credentials no one could counterfeit. Accent, of course, but also the way they laughed at a certain joke you'd only know if your grandmother had kept a certain kind of basket by her bed. These were not laws. They were filters that let gene flow travel far enough to keep the thread strong without snapping. Sickness taught us to borrow each other's strengths at the level beneath speech. Someone with a body that had learned one fever's language could nurse another who had not. Skin to skin and breath shared in a hut that smelled of ash and herb was a technology as real as the point on a spear. Immunity moved through contact, and so did ideas for preventing the need for immunity. Boil the water that looks clear. Let the meat that looks fine rest where the flies cannot touch it for an hour. If the flies do not return when you bring it back into air, it is lying to you. The tests were small, simple, repeatable. They became reflexes, and reflexes became tradition, and tradition became the background hum that allowed attention to be spent on the new. Across distance, ideas began to move faster than the feet that carried them. A sight line of hills could transmit a message in a day. Smoke twists and fire breaks, the grammar of flame added to the grammar of words. Runners took the long path with news and brought back a handful of foreign tricks that were tested gently at home. Most failed. A few stuck, and in sticking became so local that their foreignness disappeared. If you laid all these exchanges end to end, they would look like trade. In the refuge they looked like hospitality, the practice of letting a stranger's small differences linger long enough to become your own. That willingness to keep a guest chair for a new pattern, not forever, not carelessly, was another shard that drifted toward fixation. Groups that practiced it got to keep the stranger's luck when their own ran thin. You can trace the same logic in our sleeping. In a long emergency, rest is not a vacation, it is maintenance. We learned to sleep like flocks, brains passing the baton so someone always hovered just above waking, so the night was never entirely unguarded and never entirely tense. Songs shaped the threshold states, pulling people down gently, bringing them up gently, because a startled wake is noisy, and noise is expensive. Dreams rehearsed hunts and reconciliations the way a child rehearses a story alone under a blanket, getting the pauses right, letting the mind test 1,000 futures cheaply. Those whose dreams ran too hot were given the cool tasks in the morning. Those who woke cold were given movement first. Allocation like this looks like care. It is also a machine for smoothing the spikes that can destroy a little population by accident. Our unity, thickened by loss, refined by necessity, learned to tolerate increasing complexity without cracking. More standardized tools did not erase improvisation. They freed a hand to improvise only where it mattered. More reliable rituals did not strangle novelty. They created a stage where novelty could be noticed and judged without being mistaken for threat. The seam in the chromosome, the drift in the gene pool, the small consolidation of culture and craft, they were not reasons we survived, not alone. They were the scaffolding that kept the building standing while new floors were added. The ones that would eventually offer a view far enough to see the next valley opening, the next narrow and patient place where enough could gather, and then, slowly, begin home to multiply again. The long night did not arrive with drums. It thickened year by year until the calendar most people kept was patience. Bands rose and slumped like breath. Never in unison, never entirely alone. A few fires went out in bad seasons, and a few new ones took light at the edges of the quilt, where a pair of walkers found a trickle that had not yet been named. The land taught a curriculum of scarcity and choreography. Move when the wind brings knives, stay when shade invents itself. Share until sharing becomes a reflex that lives in wrists and jaw, and the pace at which a pot is tipped toward a stranger's bowl. Across the basin and its neighbouring basins, camps behaved like constellations, appearing, fading, reappearing in slightly new arrangements, held together by agreements that didn't need a word like treaty. People knew the routes that salt takes through bodies, and the routes that news takes through valleys. In the moon, when fish stacked themselves like tight thoughts in deep bends, a line of smoke would rise from the mouth of the river and curl twice. A sign that the racks were working, that there would be trade, that the place with the wind that never lied would host a gathering. Runners walked rather than ran because rushing wastes. They carried nothing heavier than greetings and a list of small shortages they hoped would be met. The gatherings were markets without prices. You could tell who had travelled far by the smell on their clothes, and by the way they looked at the ground first, not the people. Stone from places the home fires had never seen, blue-grey that parted like cold glass, black stuff harder than stubbornness, changed hands for foods that kept, for cords that did not rot, for a way of tying reeds that taught water to be useful. Stories moved in the same baskets, a new design for a throwing stick, a song that reminded you in which order to lay green leaves over hot stones so the roots inside turned sweet but not ruined, a trick for convincing stubborn embers to live through rain. Small children watched the trader's hands and learned what competence looks like when it forgets to perform itself. The long night's arithmetic was cruel, but within it people found ways to smooth the spikes. They cashed against the meanness of weather. Meat smoked with leaves that made a sweet skin, gourds of fat buried in cool earth under a tile of rock, baskets of tubers in a pit lined with bark whose scent sent insects elsewhere. They built larders out of shade. They turned fallen logs into cupboards where only small hands could reach. They planted nothing and yet gardened the wild by not taking first fruits, by leaving seed heads to shake in a breeze that worked a little bit for them. Sometimes they burned the old grass in careful patches when the wind was obedient, and the next season the new grass called animals as if by promise, and those who had done the burning ate because they had risked a little smoke at the right time. Knowledge needed keeping as much as food did. Knotted cords recorded debts that were really memories of kindness. 3 knots for visits with dried fish during last year's dry. An extra twist to say it had arrived on a day after a bad fall, when kindness counts more. Notched sticks spoke in a grammar of cuts and spacings. This many traps, that many sprung, this bend of river now too clever to feed you for a month. A child could pass a finger along the notches and recite, their voice matching the distance between marks, the way walking matches the length of a leg. Charcoal on flat stones drew maps that the rain erased by design, because maps should be updated often. People married like diplomats with good manners. The bands were not large enough to forget how close kin sits to the hearth, so rules wore the clothes of songs. Do not take a partner who learned to laugh the same way you did. Take one whose word for a certain bird is the word you forget each spring. Take one whose grandmother's recipe for glue does not smell like yours. Courting took seasons. Gifts travelled back and forth. Salted fish, 1 month. Beads the next. A small basket of charcoal ground fine and mixed with fat that would make a baby's skin heal quick after the inevitable scrapes. When finally a person changed camps, they arrived with 2 languages worth of names for the same wind, and in a thin world that kind of richness was not decoration, it was redundancy. A second rope on a steep climb. When conflict found a crack, the crack was sanded rather than widened. Arguments were walked, not shouted. The path to the middle ground crossed a known patch of shade where voices lower by reflex and a stone where petitioners sat in the order in which they had arrived. The uncomfortable stone that encouraged people to get to the point. There were games whose sole purpose was to let anger leave a body without paying rent in blood, tugging circles that trained hands strong and turned rivalry into laughter, throwing contests that made mockery fashionable only when the throws were beautiful. Someone always carried a reed flute, not because anyone needed music to breathe, but because music braided attention into one rope and kept it from lashing. Illness and injury arrived like uninvited weather, and were greeted with ritual because ritual is a kit of instructions that does not fail when fright chews holes in memory. Bones were set with splints made from river reeds and bark, bound with cords the colour of the last good sunset someone had seen, because colour is medicine too, and the body believes what the eyes tell it, more readily than what the mouth claims. Fever was escorted rather than battled. Damp cloth, slow songs, hands that cooled and did not startle, a sequence of sips that taught a throat to remember swallowing. Healers made no claims to power beyond practice. Their magic was repetition and observation, noticing that a cough eased when a fire was moved 3 handspans farther from the sleeping place, noticing that a certain root's tea made a child thirsty for the water they needed, noticing that grief can be persuaded to sit down if it is given a job, like sorting smooth pebbles by weight in the dark. In the long night, loss and birth ran side by side and taught each other humility. Babies arrived with wrists thin as twigs and lungs that learned rhythm from a mother's heart pressed to their ear. Names were provisional at first, and chosen to call something good into a life, names like Day's Cool Edge or Small Rain After Heat, then hardened into the ones that would travel on notched sticks and chords and songs. Orphans belonged immediately to the entire ring of adults. To leave a child in the sole custody of one grief was considered both unkind and impractical. The dead were acknowledged without being asked to leave entirely. A place at the edge of the fire stayed empty for a moon and then wasn't. The absence became part of the seating order, but didn't turn into a whole. Grief was a skill that could be taught, and those who were good at it became as valued as hunters. The night was classroom and theatre. Under the river of sky, people rehearsed futures the way hands rehearse edges. If the wind changes at the notch and the spring clouds, then the next camp is not the ridge, but the shelf. If the shelf is taken by those who welcomed us 2 rains ago, then we will carry our courtesy to the stand of bitter trees and ask their roots to forgive us. Stars offered a clock that did not break and a map that did not move. The bright one that rose where the land dipped meant insects would be plenty in 2 nights. The fuzzy patch just to the left meant nights would feel colder than they were, and children should sleep 2 to a skin. Someone always knew where the moon would slip behind the hills, not in numbers, but in pointing. And pointing is a language older than names. Tools matured without becoming proud. Fire-hardened digging sticks kept their place beside blades that could shave hair. Sandals woven from sinew and bark lowered the cost of distance without making people forget how to read the ground. Bone needles stitched skins into clothing that remembered the shape of the wearer. Seams were placed where they would not rub a day's patience raw. Snares set on game trails were tied with knots that came apart as easily as they held fast because reuse is a theology too. Nets learned to carry stones where the current wanted to bully them. Fish learned new ways to be fooled. People learned new ways to apologize to the river by loosening the net and letting a portion of the catch swim back through like luck being saved for a friend. Signal systems acquired accents. Smoke was not simply more or less, it was tall or shy, quick or lazy, the kind that says we are here, or you should not be. A shiny flake of stone flashed from a ridge could carry a greeting 3 valleys wide, and only those who had agreed on the rhythm could hear the meaning in it. Bird calls borrowed from messages were adjusted so that birds did not spend their lives confused. The people were careful to speak in a dialect the animals learned to ignore. A line of charcoal circles on a rock face read from left to right or from right to left depending on the river's flow. Anyone who lived near its moods would know which direction the story travelled that season. Hunger did not leave. It changed shape often enough to teach adaptability without turning people into its servants entirely. On lean weeks, the pace of talk slowed because mouths do not waste water on words. People ate the future by nibbling at caches, then paid it back with work when the wind shifted kinder. When a thief took more than they were owed from a shared pit, the punishment was an education. They were given the job of keeping the next cache, and every evening 3 elders came to sit and talk while their hands counted and their eyes learned. Shame was used sparingly because it rots faster than meat. Pride was used sparingly too because it burns calories everyone needs. Crafts that seemed extravagant were really rehearsals for survival. A flute carved from bird bone taught breath control to a generation that would later use that control to stay calm when a hunt turned to chaos. Feathers threaded into hair announced skill with hands that could later stitch wounds without making a bad situation worse. Paint on a wrist in a zigzag not only looked like a river, it reminded the wearer which side of that actual river had the gentle bank in flood. The good crossing no one had time to forget. Even games of chance carried lessons. Shells shaken in a bowl trained ears to discriminate patterns in noise. Guessing correctly mattered less than listening well. Weather offered tests that over the years felt like favours. A dust storm taught everyone which corner of a hut needed reinforcing and which possessions could live outside without injury. A sudden cold snap made families invent new sleeping arrangements that saved heat and strengthened alliances. Lightning set the hill loud with fire, and the next season grasses grew tender and sweet, and the animals returned, and people walked among the blackened trunks and said their thanks in the only way thanks mattered there, by harvesting carefully and leaving enough behind that the hill would consider inviting them again. As the long night wore on, the mine's library added shelves for contingency. People learned to think in branches. If not this, then that. If neither, then the quiet third option that keeps children alive and pride intact. Plans grew tool slots. A big plan carried small ones inside it, like a skin carries scars, each a healed lesson. Bands that had practiced branching could split without shattering, when drought pinched, or when generosity needed to be spread thinner to avoid tearing. The split did not mean anger. It meant math done with feet. What we would later call culture kept time with what we would later call ecology. The people tended the place that tended them. They told stories in which rivers had opinions and hills moods, not because they were foolish, but because a place with a personality is easier to remember in a crisis. Springs were greeted, even on days when thirst made greetings taste extravagant. Trees that had shaded a dozen births were touched on the way past as if to let the tree keep track of the tally with the rest of them. Gratitude was not a religion. It was a memory aid tuned to the truth that the world had no obligation to remain kind. And still, between the dry thunder of long cycles, there were soft pulses of luck. A year when the termites came twice, a month when a cloud decided to live on the lip of the gorge and wrung itself out every afternoon like a cloth. A day when two bands arrived at the same fish bend and both had enough, and both had stories worth the walk. Children grew and the old remembered their own hungry childhoods and smiled at the symmetry, and when evening returned like a sensible friend, embers in three camps were roused at the same moment by people who did not know each other's names, and nevertheless shared the same habit of breathing before the first spark, as if asking the air whether it was ready to be useful again. The long night continued, not as punishment but as practice, and hands kept working and eyes kept watching and feet kept learning the lightest way forward through a world that, one morning soon, would begin to loosen its grip just enough for paths to widen without anyone quite noticing at first. Dawn did not pour over the world like light from a broken bowl, it seeped. It stitched itself along the edges where shade had learned to be patient. Rains came with a memory again, not just as accidents, and grass took the hint and grew with its old confidence, blade beside blade until herds returned, as if out of a story the elders had kept warm in their mouths for years. Rivers let go of their bitterness. They carried silt like gifts and rolled smooth stones back into the bends where children tested their balance and learned the lessons that balance always has to teach. That a foot knows what a mind will claim later. That a body can talk a path into revealing its safer version if the talking is slow. The bands who had practiced staying began to practice leaving with intention. Trails that used to be escape routes softened into roads. The camps of the refuge rotated wider and kept rotating until their pattern touched neighbouring basins and then the next. People moved not because the ground insisted, but because the ground allowed. Movement changed its voice, from the hard breath of hunger to the conversational pace of curiosity. And curiosity spent itself on details that had been too expensive to notice before. which reed made a basket that did not bruise fruit, which slope kept cold air like a pocket so that meat slept there longer, which wood sang when it burned and which only sulked and smoked, and how to make the sulkers useful anyway. The toolkit matured the way seasons mature, by repetition, with small decisive variations. Points got slimmer and more deliberate, not just edges, but ideas about edges. Barbs that knew how to hold on. Tangs meant to deserve the handles they were given. Hafting went from a trick to a discipline. Resin recipes stopped being family secrets and started being the kind of knowledge everyone owned, improved with a pinch of ash, a breath more heat, cured under shade because sun can be a bully. A seam of sinew-binding stone to wood looked, from a distance, like decoration. Up close it was engineering. Crossing that distributed stress, wraps that shrugged off water, knots that released only when asked with the right tug. A throwing stick learnt the curve of a wrist and returned a different trajectory for its loyalty. A spear learned flight like a habit. Fire finally stepped out of survival's vocabulary and into management's. Where once it was a second son to be carried and protected, now it was also a tool for asking grass to be tender in the spring, for inviting herds to pause where a ravine could guide them safely into a narrow fate. Patches were burned as if the land were a loom. The new green came on schedule, and the animals answered as if to a remembered promise. People smoked food not only to keep it, but to move time around so that a plenty day could pay a debt to a lean one. Stones glowed in pits and then gave their heat back slowly to roots that grudged bitterness, when raw and yielded sweetness when taught. Words learned to keep pace. They didn't get grander, they got handier. Grammar put shelves in the mind. Tenses allowed a person to place a task in tomorrow and return to it unlost. Conditionals sharpened planning. If the valley fog holds beyond the first bird, set traps low. If a wind from the salt place rides at dusk, the insects will swarm above the water, and fish will forget to be clever. Names grew deep. A hill wasn't just a hill. It was the bent shoulder where the morning shade runs late, which tells you where not to be when noon accuses. A child could recite a path in 2 breaths and carry a caravan across a week without touching a map. At night, gatherings thickened into habit. The markets of the long night, where things moved because moving them made survival softer, became festivals of usefulness. The blue-grey stone that broke like cold water met a new adhesive made from a plant no one had seen 3 lifetimes to the south. Nets learned a better knot from a coast where the wind wrote different music on the skin. A circle of elders set a challenge. Name 5 ways to keep meat sweet for 10 days without offending the sky. Solution circled. Smoke with leaves that carry sugar. Pack in clay cooked just enough to sweat. Hang over a cold crack that exhales all day. Slice thin and dry in the draught that always runs between the twin boulders. Store under water in a jar that keeps the river out and the cool in. The children watched and learned that invention sounds like trivia until it doesn't. Decoration leaned into function without apology. Beads tracked promises. The spacing of ochre stripes on a forearm told time as well as a shadow on a stick. A spiral carved on the haft of a spear thrower taught a hand where to grip for different distances. A row of dots marched along a basket's rim was a recipe you could pour and remember. 1 part fat to 2 of crushed seed to a careful handful of bitter root that turns friendly when heat has had a word. Songs did what they had always done, carry what needed carrying, but their choruses spread like a path, loud enough to be learned by anyone passing through, sturdy enough that if a camp forgot a verse, the next camp over could lend it back intact. As the map of habit extended, the body adjusted to a larger neighbourhood. Feet learned to save their arches for stone, to flatten slightly on sand, to read the temperature of mud through leather. Backs discovered the safe way to carry 2 gourds and a sleeping child without turning a spine into complaint. Hands grew a second literacy, one for bark and sinew and hide, one for signal. Palm out means wait, palm turned means come, fingers curved twice means pretend to be a stone. Eyes adopted the pace of the new distances, able to hold far and near in the same thought. The shimmer on the horizon that promises a lake, and the faint breaking grass that betrays a snare that was set by someone with a different accent and a similar hunger. The social web climbed a size. Bands became lines of exchange braided into territories that were not fences, but agreements. This hill will be burned by us this year, and by you the next. That spring belongs to everyone, but speaks first to the thirsty and only then to the curious. Gifts walked ahead of people, a coil of cordage left in the crook of a tree branch, a little packet of salt wrapped in dry leaf and tucked where a traveller's hand would go to steady itself on a scramble. A handful of seeds pushed into soft soil near a camp that had treated a stranger well. Reciprocity moved like weather, uncommanded and real. Mating customs turned from caution into architecture. The rules that had first protected the smallness of us now built bridges between widening shores. A person who had learned to walk at the pace of a northern wind brought that patience into a southern camp where impatience wasted water. A woman whose aunt taught a resin that held even after the third rain married into a group, where handles had a reputation for failing at exactly the wrong moment. Children born to these arrangements grew up speaking two ways to say wait and two ways to say now, and in a world where timing was both law and mercy. But bilingualism kept fires lit and tempers civilized. The dead, too, shaped the day, though the day had more space now. Bodies were placed with attention that looked like love, and was also engineering. Heads toward the wind so that scent drifted away from where hyenas patrolled. Graves lined with stones so that water passed without argument. Markers set with patterns that a foot would feel before it destroyed something precious in the grass. Grave goods carried data for those who might never see the burial. A broken point near the left hand said the person had been right-handed and probably taught. A shell bead where a neck had been said there was trade with the place where the river curled back on itself and found salt. Memory became a ledger everybody could audit with eyes and fingers. The river taught boats, first as toys, reeds tied and pushed in eddies, little rafts spun into whirlpools and laughed at when they survived. Then as trials, bundles of buoyant stalks lashed so that a grown body could trust them across a channel not deep but patient. Then as habit, ferrying meat so crocodiles didn't do the math for you, crossing where banks were jealous, and following a shore longer than a day's walk because the boat saved ankles and time. Ingenious cowards prospered. Bravery still had its place, but was no longer the only way to prove a life. People learned to keep land within reach, even when a horizon began to look like an invitation to leave land behind for a while. Coasts became classrooms for thinking with more than two directions. Numbers sharpened their edges without losing their friendship with the body. Counting left fingers and toes and moved into 3 dimensions, knots in a cord for days, beads on a loop for months, marks on a staff for the time it took a child to become a person who could walk a day without help. Measures settled into standards as forgiving as they were firm. A spear length was from sternum to extended fingers. A day's walk was from the song that started at dawn to the verse that sounded right when the shadows had gone long. A fair share was what fit comfortably into 2 hands, unspilled. The standards could be argued with, and the arguments taught everyone how not to cheat. Animals adapted to us adapting to them. Dogs' grandchildren stopped sleeping just outside the circle and started sleeping just inside, noses twitching at news the humans didn't register yet. Goats adopted the camp and then, with gentle supervision, adopted the waiting thicket whose leaves they loved, so the food began to grow where people planned for it, not only where accidents allowed. Fish traps learned the upstream and downstream grammar, and some borrowed gate-like ideas from the way acacia thorns tangle a careless animal. People watched swallows and learned when to throw the net, and when to sit and be content with a smaller catch and a fuller tomorrow. Art got bolder, not because the new world demanded decoration, but because beauty had become the cunning way knowledge multiplied. A mask held a story about a disease that crossed camps and how to make it turn back. A drum pattern mapped the order in which villagers should call and answer during a hunt so that sound looked like a wall to animals without imagination. Children painted their hands and pressed them on stone, and above the little hands someone pressed a big hand. And together those prints said, "We were here," and also, "This is the size of palm that can close a certain trap, and this is the size that can reach into it safely." If someone accused the painters of hiding instructions inside joy, the painters smiled and invited them to try to stop seeing the lesson once they had seen it once. The sky stretched its curriculum. People stopped merely reading the stars and started cross-indexing them. When this awkward cluster rose, the ants did this. When the bright wanderer hung low for a week, frogs spoke more often, and the frogs couldn't be wrong, not all at once, so rain was coming or a predator was gone. The calendar of nights braided into the calendar of work. Tasks were scheduled by constellations as much as by appetite. Resins collected when the moon was a sliver because they hardened better. Certain hunts planned when darkness was honest and shadows couldn't lie. If a band forgot its place in the sky's song, the next one over could lend the tune, and in return receive the verse about wind that only the first band's gorge could teach. What we would later call spirituality did its work without lecturing. Gratitude became infrastructure, a way to keep relationships with place and animal and weather in good repair. People said words to springs not because springs had ears, but because people with mouths needed to remember that water was favour, not a right. They painted lines where feet should not press because silence is a delicate resource in a world that listens before it speaks. They invented taboos to keep cleverness from eating its own seed corn. Not every new trick is a good one. Not every hill that can be burned should be. Not every animal that can be fooled should be fooled this season. Restraint was taught as style, elegance in how you leave a place as indistinguishable from elegance in how you arrive. The road threw out branches. Some bands leaned into cold and learned how to make air behave kindly inside skins stitched close, noses buried in collars, fires built like arguments, focused, efficient, unwilling to waste. Others climbed and learned to borrow breath from a thinner world by moving slowly and carrying fewer sentences between steps. Others followed coasts, resenting and then loving salt, and built kitchens that thought with wet and wind and the habit fish have of schooling when fear hums low through the water. The differences were not yet rules, they were accents, and accents are just futures learning to speak softly before they learn to speak loud. In the widening, not everything went forward. Some tricks were misunderstood and then abandoned, and later rediscovered with a better explanation. Some tools went out of fashion not because they failed, but because a substitute fit a local rhythm more politely. That was part of the dawn as well. Failure lost its drama. A bad plan became a small plan next time, not an omen. People learned to carry backup ideas the way they carried spare embers, protected, quiet, ready to be coaxed into flame when the main fire sulked. There were still long silences. Seasons still pinched hard enough that cheeks hollowed and tempers thinned, but the silences sat among more words now, like rests between notes rather than the end of a song. A person could stand on a ridge and name 10 fires by smoke alone, knowing none of them belonged to enemies and all of them belonged to hunger and hope braided into something that looked like a road. If you followed that road, it would take you past markers you could feel in your bones, the familiar shape of a blade in a stranger's hand, the rhythm of a lullaby you didn't know but could hum along to by the second verse, a child laughing at a game your grandmother had invented to teach patience to fingers. And beyond another ridge, there were lands that held their cold longer, and caves that remembered other tenants, and valleys where the wind argued in a new dialect, and rivers that lifted you toward mouths that opened into distances. People went anyway, carrying the seam in their blood and the memory of a basin that had taught them how to stay so well that they could finally leave without breaking, stepping into mornings that were not brighter, exactly, but wider. Mornings that asked for new kinds of attention and promised, without promising, that if attention was paid in full and shared without stinginess, the road would keep unfolding beneath careful feet. Let the fire in your mind sink to quiet embers, the way our ancestors did when the work of the day was finished and the stars took their watch. We are here because a small stubborn thread refused to break, because hands shared, voices taught, and hearts learned the rhythm of patience. That same rhythm is yours tonight. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If your thoughts are still wandering, give them a gentler path. One breath in, one breath out, like water finding its level. Thank you for spending this night with me. If this helped you drift, leave a little sign for the morning, say hello in the comments. And if you'd like more quiet journeys like this, tap subscribe so you can find the fire again next time. Sleep well, descendant of survivors, the story will be here when you wake.